Hey everyone, I'm Mike Henry, and before we get started, we have a little bit of housekeeping to do. There's a website called Coffee. You can see the link here from my page on Coffee. It's a cool idea where you just basically give a couple of bucks, enough money to get somebody a cup of coffee. And it's a nice way to contribute to something like this channel without having long-term commitments. Also, I'm now on Society 6, where you can buy prints of a number of my recent pieces. If people like the stuff that they're getting from Society 6 and want me to do more prints or have suggestions on ones that I should put up, I'm happy to do so. I'm just really doing this because people have been asking for a long time, and I wanted to finally be able to provide that service. Also, I'm on Teespring, where you can get shirts with some of my designs on them. I haven't done any new ones in a while because there hasn't really been a lot of traffic there, but if you like what you see there, or again, you have suggestions for things you'd like to see on a shirt, let me know. The link is right there. The link is also down below, and I believe it's linked somewhere around this video because YouTube integrates with Teespring. So go check that out and tell me what you think. And if you're ever looking for any of those links or any other places I might be on the internet, this is the link for you. Linktree/Zatransis, which is like linkter.ee/Zatransis, and it'll give you a list of all of those links at anywhere basically that I am on the internet. So with all of that out of the way, let's get into the video. Hey everyone, welcome to this Procreate demo for the piece I call I Will Light the Way, episode 200. So this piece I recently did at Sketchbomb, although that's a little untrue. I did part of this at Sketchbomb and then I finished it at home. What you're seeing first is the sketch part that I did there. I took about 2 hours at Sketchbomb to do the first, I guess you could almost say, color key of this painting, because it doesn't get much beyond that. We had 3 themes, and one of the themes was artist choice because I couldn't think of a third theme, and ultimately that's what I ended up running with. There were other themes that I thought I would do, and then at the last second I just thought, okay, actually I'll just do whatever, and I feel like doing this sort of purple elf that's casting a little simple flame spell. And so that was the entire spirit behind this piece, I guess. Those of you who've watched this channel for a while know that when I do a full color piece at Sketchbomb, I usually bring it home, and in the next day or something I just give it another 30 minutes to maybe 2 hours at most of love. For this one I actually went far further. As I said, this stage was only about 2 hours worth of work, and then I brought it home and probably put another 2 hours, maybe even 3 hours into it, just because I liked it and I really felt like the version of it that I had at the end of Sketchbomb didn't come together the way I would have wanted it to. Usually when I'm adding the extra stuff, it's just kind of like refinement. For this one it was a lot more about just getting it right, because I thought that it wasn't good from I didn't think the lighting was complete. I didn't think the color choices of the design were very good. There were some anatomical things that I wanted to change, and I just decided that I was going to actually really put the work in to get it where I wanted it to. So now that I've talked about the grand plot of how this will go, the one other thing I'll mention is that there will be 3 major stages to this. There's the stage where I'm done with it at the end of Sketchbomb. There's the stage where I'm kind of trying to save it as is the next day, and I'm trying to just kind of work it a little bit. And then there's the stage where I realize all my problems and I take like a big step in a different direction and finish it off. So where we're at now, you can see that I've already moved into the ambient occlusion phase. I'm obviously trying to move really quick here, so in general it's fairly messy, but I kind of knew that it would be because I was just trying to get it done really quick, like in a bar. My kid came to Sketchbomb, so I was also trying to watch him, although he ended up spending a lot of his time just chatting with people at Sketchbomb, which was super cool. But there was sort of a lot going on, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, I've got a character, so this is like upper body, he's got some accessories, it's not crazy, but he's got some. He's got this flame, he's got there's a hand in the piece, and these aren't things where it's like, we draw these things all the time, but when you're just trying to control that scope, it's like, man, stuck a lot of stuff in here, which I think has been my theme lately at Sketchbomb, is that I've been doing a little too much given the time that I have. So I'm either trying to do too much because I'm expecting too much, I'm like trying to render too much or something like that, or I'm including too many elements in the piece. That's something for me to solve at the next Sketch Bomb, which, by the way, is February 29th. This month we're doing a Leap Day Sketch Bomb, which is pretty cool. I'm pretty sure we've never done that. So those are like the levels of complication that I'm thinking about that I need to reduce. One of the big things being sticking that flame in here. You can't just do sort of like the normal lighting that you do. You follow similar rules, but now that you have like a really distinct light source, there's more that you have to keep track of, which means there's less room for error. It's going to be more obvious when you screw that up. So these are just layers of complexity that I introduced to myself because I'm a big dum-dum and I thought that I'd still be able to bang it out in 2 hours. Some of you out there may say, actually, I can bang that out in 2 hours. Why did it take you so long? It just did. I just didn't do it in as fast as I'd hoped. It's that simple. Different people, different speeds. So you can maybe make out that the color of the shadow that I'm using here is a cool one. I'm figuring with this orange light, let's go with a cool shadow, and then we'll support that by making like the room cool. If you're kind of already keeping track of lighting and colors at this point, even though we're at the sort of beginning of the piece, you'll see that he's wearing some cool colors. He's got a pop of warm with the scarf. There's also a little bit of warm in the green, because green is sort of warm cool, depending on which way it leans. And then you've got the cool skin. And then if that means the background's also cool, you can already start seeing that I'm going to start having trouble separating this. There's going to be no trouble telling where the fire is, because the fire is going to be this hot orange thing, the scarf as well. So I'm going to have some clarity problems at some point. So we'll touch on that when we actually get there. What we're using right now in this piece is we're using the new turpentine brush, which is in the brush set that I recently created, which is also linked down below in the description. I'm using that for both my painting brush as well as for my smudge brush. And with the ambient occlusion, that's where I'm doing the most amount of smudging. You can see it actually just by watching how it's going in. It goes in fairly hard and then it softens, and that's why we're getting these sort of soft shadows. Now again, I'm moving really quickly here, so it's not quite as soft and not quite as just in general good as I would like it to be, but that is what's happening here. I'm putting it down fairly hard, like right there in the ear is a perfect example. I sketch in essentially the loose parameters of that ear anatomy, and then I start smudging it around so that I can actually turn that into form instead of just lines. There's some dog incessantly barking outside in my neighborhood, so if that's coming through the mic, I apologize. It's annoying me, so if it's coming through, it's probably annoying you, but unfortunately this is the only window I have to record, so I hope it's not really hearable in the recording. So we are also using the Select Paint, Select Clear method. That is linked down below if you'd like more details. Since we're using that method, you can exactly tell kind of where my layer stacks are in the order by which I am doing the shadows. So right now we're on the scarf. The scarf is, I believe, the highest layer in the stack aside from the flame. But even though the flame is a part of the flats, we're going to be treating it completely differently because we need it to have different effects overall. You can also see that the eye has gotten a glow. I decide when I was sketching him, I didn't know I was going to make him kind of like a night elf. He's closer to like a WoW night elf than like a D&D drow type thing. But I was going to originally make him like a, I don't know, just like Caucasian skinned elf with a regular eye. And then when I decided, no, let's have more fun with this and make it a weirder skin tone, let's go purple, I was like, okay, well then let's also make the hair green and make his eyes glow. So that's why the flats are a little bit not pulling from what the sketch is implying. So, which is also kind of cool because in the sketch he's like looking at us, almost like he's like, hey, I'm making this flame. But with the iris and the pupil not defined, it's kind of up to you where he's looking. You could either take this as he's almost kind of enamored with his own flame, or maybe he's looking at us, or maybe he's looking like further into the area they're in, something like that. So where we're at now is we've put in the ambient occlusion shadow. We are painting in the hard shadows that are being cast, as well as using that layer to round out the form a little bit and darken some of the, like, say, like the backside of his hair, which is what I was just painting in there. Using that flame, of course, as the lighting source. Now, you'll see here, I start figuring out, like, oh man, this is going to actually have to be a really big shadow because I've exaggerated his nose so much. And you can see the background right now is warm because this is me sort of like in real time realizing, ooh, I don't know if this is gonna, I don't know if he's going to stand out if this background is a cool color. And so I think I'll try to catch and explain as much as I can as it goes, but I think you can see my thought process. You can probably feel that I'm rushed, and you can feel that I'm making some bad decisions here or there. And then later when we get to the part where I am fixing those problems, I'll also try to talk through it, but I think it'll be really clear when you see how I'm fixing it and why I'm having to do that. So I want to stress when I said that I wasn't happy with this, because I know sometimes people say, like, oh, you're not happy with it? Like, I wish I could do whatever. I think that's fine. I mean, when I was learning how to do art, I would probably feel that way about some people when they say, like, this was just a quick sketch, and I'd be like, a quick sketch, that's the best thing that I've, so I totally understand that sentiment. I think that the point when I say that I wasn't happy with it is that I know what I can do, and I know, more importantly, like, what's in my head that I want to do, which I think is that thing for artists where we're always pursuing that thing that's in our head and trying to get that right. And so when I say that I wasn't happy with it, I want to stress that I'm not saying I wasn't happy with it and, like, I suck, and somehow you should take that as a way of thinking to yourself, well, like, if he's saying that about his work, like, what about me? Because I know that that's like a self-defeatist artist mentality that we all have sometimes. But really what I'm trying to say is, whenever you start a piece, you have an idea of where you want that to go, and it'll always exceed your skills, and you're always pushing towards that. And so when I finished this, I thought that not only did I succeed in hitting my vision, but I didn't succeed in what I know I can do just sort of in general. So that's why I wasn't happy with it, and I decided to give it some extra love. Now we're coming in at the very end of the first stage. This is about where I was at the end of Sketch Bomb, so I'm going to put a hold, so to speak, on that version of it, and we'll talk about it. So here we're just adding some extra lighting things, making sure that the flame and the glow is selling. I tried to do this little stylistic highlight around his finger, and it looks like shit, so we end up killing that pretty quickly once we get to the let's clean this up phase. Now just adding some extra rounding off of the form, and here is the final piece. And by final piece, I mean the final piece that night. So again, this was 2 hours, sketch to paint. Things I don't like about it. Actually, in a second, you're going to see some little sketchy shit where I talk about what I didn't like. But I think that overall, you and I just know that this could be a lot better. There's some lacking form, and colors are bad, and it's just not super great. So let's jump to where I start doing my sort of deconstruct and start fixing it, trying to find ways to fix it. So I start writing these notes down. I actually didn't revisit these notes, but I basically hit everything except for one of the negatives. So first I write the good. The skin is interesting, basically just noting that making him like a night elf was probably good. The lighting could be cool. That means cool like as in a cool color, not as in it could be looking cool, although it could be doing that as well. And the general premise is okay. Now I start writing down the bad. First thing I do is I just sort of circle it and say, like, it's generic. It is admittedly generic, and I wouldn't say that I necessarily made it less generic. And then here I put the lighting needs to be better, because right now I just feel like it's really rough, and I just sort of say, like, that whole thing needs to be good. And the palette is a mess. I mean, there's things that are going on here that I guess are theoretically okay, but it's just with that green and that blue and that pink and that, it just needs some love. So let's give it that. First thing, start stripping off all the layers and get back down to the flats. Now you're going to see a lot of small changes here. I wouldn't say that I can point out everything because there's going to be some minutia going on, but the main thing here is fixing my core flats. Since those flats are the foundation of the piece, if those aren't great, the rest of it isn't going to be great. So the way I'm doing that is by first addressing anatomy stuff. You could see maybe a few seconds ago, the shoulder that's closest to us, I rounded that off a little bit more, added just a little bit more interest. The distant arm and the body, making some adjustments there. I don't know when it's going to come in, but I know once I was done painting it, I was like, holy shit, that finger is long. So we shortened that finger. And then just across it, we're just going to clean it up and make things better. Here I start messing with the idea of changing the design of that leather sleeve, and I end up actually not going with that. But then here we're fixing that bracer. He's got this sort of asymmetrical thing going on where his left arm has leather all the way up to almost his deltoid, and then he's got kind of a bigger glove, and then the other side the glove's rolled up and he's got shorter. That maybe is for a reason. We're not going to say we know what the reason is right now. We added the little bindings on the front of his tunic. His finger got fixed and the rest of his hand got fixed. And now you can see we're also adding some little silhouette changes on the scarf so that we can make sure that that's just a little bit more interesting than it was before. Adding these little rips in the top of the cowly part of that scarf so that it just has a little more visual interest. We're also cleaning up the hair a bit and then adding some extra hair sort of flowing off the front just so that it's a little more, it's a little bit less of like a block of hair. His 5 o'clock shadow is going to stay. We're going to clean up though like the darkening around his eyes and the blush on his nose and ears. Or ear, I mean there's really only one that's visible. We also changed the eye anatomy a little bit. You'll see right now it's just really simplistic. We end up rounding it off a little, giving it more form, giving it a heavier eyelash on top. So you can see right there, it just got more socketed into the eye by getting the anatomy a little bit tighter. And now we also changed some colors here. His hair just got a little bit bluer instead of green. And see, that was us turning on all those layers again. So now all those layers still react to all of our color changes underneath, and that means there's going to be some spots where we have to adjust it. Like for instance, we never took into account the little bindings on the front of his tunic. We never took into account the hair on the extra hair on his head, shortened the finger, also just sort of cleaning up any type of spot where there's information that has changed. There's actually kind of a weird way you can think about it is it's kind of like telephone where like the flats are saying something and then the ambient occlusion is saying something and then the hard shadow is saying something, and if they're not communicating the right things to each other, it'll be all sort of like disjointed, and then at the end you get something that's all garbled and messy. So like if your flat is a ball and then your ambient occlusion is a triangle and then your direct shadow is a square and they're all overlaid, it's going to look weird. Actually, that might look stylish, but in this case, when you're dealing with forms that you're trying to clearly communicate and they're more complex forms, that's going to become a problem if you're muddying that communication. So in some parts of this, what you're seeing is I'm doing a re-select paint, select clear of parts of this. Other ones, I'm just, when I get to them, I'm adjusting them in that moment. So some of it's a little completely destructive, Some of it is completely destructive, and other parts of it are, hey, what I've already got there is a good start. Let's just work with that. And you can see exactly where that's happening, where we have these like giant chunks taken out of the shadow. I actually really enjoy this refinement process. I just find it satisfying because you're taking something that you're not completely happy with and bringing it to a nicer stage. But it can be a little bit of like an organizational mess because when you're doing it from scratch, you kind of know everything you've touched, and then when you have to go back in and start tweaking everything, it's like, oh, did I do that yet? Or does that layer overlap with that? Or I really need to clear everything on this leather layer because it looks like shit, but that means I'm also going to clear what's on that glove layer, which I really like, and just things like that. So that was the big part of dissecting this and going and figuring out what new needs to be changed. Now, one of the things that I feel I still don't entirely address is the generic part of it. I think that his color palette is a lot stronger. I think that he's got a couple of additions, and eventually I add like an earring just to start bringing some more interesting things to him, although I wouldn't call him like a great character design. I think that when all is said and done, it's a fine illustration, but I think that if you told me that I was going to pitch that character, I would probably ask for some time to just do like a full character sketch and figure out ways that I can plus or minus him. I would add some extra stuff to like his straps. I would probably find a quality I could give him to make him a little bit more unique, because he's got like strong features, but you could also argue that if you just ran any old night elf through me and I was going to draw him, I'd probably give him like a big ass nose or a big chin or long face or whatever it is. So that doesn't really set him apart necessarily from just your average night elf. So one other thing I want to point out is we basically wrapped the shirt. We're moving on to the leather. And what I decided to do is I've got my shadow layer for the ambient occlusion, and I've got my shadow layer that's going to be for the direct light, and I decided to add a layer that's for like seams and stitching and things like that. So the one that you see on his shoulder, connecting like his shoulder and his sleeve and his, that stitching on the shoulder, that's a different layer, and what I add to the leather is also a different layer, and then everything, it's just another multiply with the same thing as the shadow. Here we're just adding in the rest for that arm, and then after all of that is done, we'll do the stitching, and then we move on to, I believe, the gloves next. Alright, I just wanted to give all of you a little bit of a break from my voice for just a little. Now we are done with the gloves. You can see that anatomy on the knuckles is cleaned up a bit. The fingers are cleaned up a bit. We'll get the stitching in there, and then we will move on to the cowl, I believe is what's next. Yeah, it's the back cowl, which you can see me fudging around right there. And then we move on to like neck, I think it's neck, hair, face. Maybe, we'll see. You'll be just as surprised as I am. It'll be exciting for the both of us. And then when we get all this AO stuff done, I think the next stage will be me putting in the lines for the hair, because I saved a layer for the hair in the same way that I did for the stitching. It'll be just another multiply layer. So speaking of multiply layers, I go over this a lot. Let's do a quick rundown. All of our shadows basically in this piece are done with the same color shadow, and it is a light. I believe in this case we ended up switching to warm. We were cool in the beginning, but we ended up switching to warm because it would just be a more interesting palette. It's a light red tan type color set to multiply. Multiply will darken. Recently I've heard people say, can you go over multiply? I actually did a video not that long ago that talks about multiply. I don't remember which one it is because I have the worst amnesia when it comes to my own artwork. But go back through the videos, and it's in the title. It says something about multiply breakdown. I explain how multiply works. So here you can see me adding the earring. This is just a flat. I'm just going back into the flat saying add this earring, and then I select it and clear it from the ambient occlusion layer, and then just add the ambient occlusion. So it's super simple. When you add a layer on top, it's always the easiest to adjust after that. So now those multiply layers, we've got an AO one, and then we've got a direct shadow one, and then we've got a bunch of little support ones that are going to help us define the extra definition or the stitching or whatever it is. The ones that are about support are usually done with the same color, which means they're going to be really dark, but then their opacity is lowered quite a bit because I'm just trying to hit some degree of midtones in there to imply that form is changing without it being just like another like big heavy shadow. It's kind of like think of Mike Mignola and how like he basically, because he works in essentially black and white, he's only got like white, and then he's got black, and then he's got anything he decides to do to sort of imply a midtone, although he usually doesn't. And in this case, you could argue that I've got white and black on the direct shadow layer, and then if I want to add additional sort of like light hitting and turning on the form, I have to add something that's in between that. If I add more of the same, it's just going to be more of the same, and it's going to look like a big Mike Mignola shadow, like a block of shadow. So instead, we'll just lower the opacity, and we'll get that nice mid-tone that we're looking for. Anytime you see the layer do what it just did, where it flipped to a normal, and then flip back to multiply, that's usually me. I've added a multiply layer, and then I want to merge them together, and you have to do it that way in Procreate, otherwise it will count it as like two multiplies and it'll recalculate the colors, and you'll see what I mean if you play around with that. So now we've rebuilt the AO layers, not from scratch, but we've worked what was there, and we're going to start moving into the direct light. Oh, I forgot to mention, I also added this cape. I totally didn't call that out, but there is now a cape as part of this guy's outfit. So that was just one big fat layer in the background. Not really much to talk about there. I know that sounds like I'm glossing over it, but it's just not that important. So what just happened there was I took all of these layers and I combined them into one new layer, and then I selected the inverse of that and I cleared. And the reason why I did that was because there were extra bits of the direct shadow layer that was exceeding his form now that I've trimmed it down in a couple of spots, and in any spot where I actually expanded his form, we're going to hit that anyways when we come through with our shadow pass. So like for instance, that what looks like a rim light on the back of his head is actually just the fact that those shadows no longer touch that part of his head, and we'll hit that when we go through there though, because we're going layer by layer, making sure that we've addressed the shadows on every layer. So this section doesn't have a whole lot to talk about. It's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to let it roll, and you can watch these shadows get adjusted. All I can say to tee it up is that I'm just keeping in mind where that flame is and doing my best to simulate the direction of all of the shadows, and then respond to the form changes that I've made in the flats when we were doing this the revisit. So let's take a look at that without me just yammering on the top of it. Okay, so the shadow is more or less done. We also added in the little warm transition on the edge of the shadow. And now we're adding in the actual parts where the light is hitting him. So we've established where the light is hitting through the placement of the shadow. Now we are colorizing that area using the flame color so that we can actually show where it's hitting and that it's impacting the color of the things that it touches as opposed to just whether or not something is lit. That is done with 2 layers. I sample the orange from the fire and I just sort of softly paint across it, and then I set that to overlay, and then I duplicate it, and there's a normal version of it as well that I use to sort of support the other one. We're getting a lot of crazy color changes happening here. That's because from my perspective as an artist, I've redone the AO, I've redone the direct shadow, I've added some of these lighting things onto it, I've redone the glow on his eye, and now I am saying, how do I reconcile the other parts, the parts that are easily changeable? So you can see I just started adding some bounce in his hair right there. We've got this green background. I thought that green could be a good way to set off his skin. Honestly, it looks like trash, and we adjust that eventually anyways. But I'm starting to add this like bounce light on his face and hair. You can see it right there on his nose. It's going into his nose right now. And that's just sort of like capturing some of whatever's coming from off screen to the right, and it's a way for us to fill out his forms a little bit better using that bounce light. If he's truly in a dark cave, there's probably nothing that would produce that, but for the sake of making it just kind of an exciting and satisfying illustration, we go ahead and do it anyhow. I'm not really seeking realism here. I'm seeking something that just kind of looks cool, and that means that you leverage real rules and then you also make some shit up at the same time to try and get what you're going for. That doesn't mean that you just do it blindly. You're doing it in an educated way, but it means that you are okay bending and breaking certain rules if it ends up fulfilling your goal, your artistic goal within the piece. So now let's take a pause at this stage of the illustration. What you're looking at is the next stage after I've done all this revampy stuff, and I'm saying, okay, maybe it's where I want it, and I save it out and I put it as a wallpaper on my phone and I stare at it a lot and I grow to hate it, and then I say, what is going on with this illustration? Why do I feel like I can't wrap this up? This seems like it would be easy. And I don't think that it's impossible to reconcile all of the colors that are on here, but one of the things that hit me was, let's just simplify this a little bit and try to increase impact as much as possible. You remember in my notes earlier, I circled the flame and I said that could be cool. So I say, okay, let's do that. And I save out a new version of the file and I start working on it where I'm saying, I'm going to make the flame blue. So I started adjusting the way the flame looks using some hue saturation changes and some other things. I changed the bounce light, and already at this stage, I'm like, oh shit, this is what I should have done from the very beginning. This is much, much cooler. So let's start working it as it is now and get it to where it needs to be using this new scheme. So everything starts going into this blue-purple range except for his eye. Which is pretty dope, right? We get this focal point of his eye. You're gonna be looking at that big bright blue flame anyhow, so it's just kind of a nice way of us looking at the flame, looking at his gaze, and then you're kind of wondering exactly where his gaze is headed. I change that bounce light to more of a purple, and I add a little bit of a gradient coming up from the edge, and then I say, this needs lines, because every time I flip the lines on for a second, I like the support. So I switch to my rough ink brush, which is also from my recently made brush set, which is linked below, and I start putting in some line definition. And I have to say, at this point, I'm like, oh shit, okay, this is it. This is the illustration. This is the palette that I need, and by adding in these support lines, it's giving it some panache that's actually making it really kind of fun to look at again, and now that I'm excited about it again, I hope other people will too. And right here is the final piece. And I think that you can see that it's come a long way from where it was at the end of Sketch Bomb. At least I hope that's how it feels. I think that it actually came out cool, and even though his core character design isn't more interesting necessarily, I feel like the stylistic treatment on top of him is more interesting, and that makes the whole piece more interesting. If I could then also revisit his design on top of it, I think it'd be totally great. So let's take a second and just look at the three major stages so that we can see how those transition. This right here is the end of Sketch Bomb version. Here's when I started playing with it, which it still needs a lot more work, but at least it's a little bit better. And then here's the final version, which I think in some short little decisions, it really went the rest of the way. Here's just a tight shot so you can see really how those lines are working to support the rest of the more painted illustration. So, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and all of the others, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you on the next one. Also, I just wanted to quickly say, this is episode 200. I can't believe that I've been making these for this long, and thank you for all the support, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be doing these. It really means a lot. So, here's to the next 200. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.